Thank you very much. Mr. Moderator, may I? Colleagues, comrades, friends, I wish to begin with an undisputed fact, which is that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, commencing in 1966, has been and continues to illegally occupy land in the sovereign county of Essequibo in the form of the total occupation of the Ancoco Island, which itself forms part of the border between Guyana and Venezuela, and half of which belongs to the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. This, in essence, was Venezuela's gift to Guyana, which attained its independence in May 1966. So to all the speak out there about this particular issue, we have to remember we have been occupied by Venezuela since 1966. To this action, the government of Guyana filed successive objections via the international portals, and Venezuela's response was to remain in occupation of Ancoco Island. All of Guyana's territory, to which I shall refer, sprung from the 1899 arbitral award, which was and is a full, final, and perfect settlement of the borders between British Guyana, United Kingdom, and Venezuela, and from 1966 between the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. With regards to the Cooperative Republic of Guyana's territorial integrity, Article 1.2 of Guyana's 1966 Constitution puts the matter of its territory in this manner, and I quote, the territory of Guyana shall comprise all the areas that immediately before the 26th of May 1966 were comprised in the former colony of British Guyana, together with such areas as may be declared by acts of parliament to form part of the territory of Guyana. Article 1.2, therefore, is consistent with international law to the extent that Guyana, as a newly independent state, became a successor state, the territory of which, that is British Guyana, immediately before independence, was a dependent territory for the international relations of which the United Kingdom was responsible. Therefore, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, at independence and thenceforth, became fully responsible for conducting its own international relations among other nations, in particular, sovereignty over its territory. Therefore, what we inherited from the British was consecrated at independence, and therefore, subsequent to that, we became totally responsible. Allow me to point out, moderator, at this juncture, an important fact, which is, as a successor state, Guyana can invoke before a tribunal all grounds of claim or objections which could have been invoked by the United Kingdom in the defense of British Guyana, and by extension in defense of Guyana. And that is exactly what we're doing at the ICJ. Therefore, the extent to which the United Kingdom exercised sovereignty over British Guyana, to that extent, Guyana, the successor state, exercises sovereignty over the same territory, of course, inclusive of Essequibo. In conformity with Article 1.2 of Guyana's 1970 Constitution, we know what 1970 and not 1966, that Constitution puts the issue of the territory in a similar manner as in 1966. And the same reasoning as the successor state applies to the 1970 Constitution. Further, Article 2 of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana's 1980 Constitution, famously referred to as the Barnum Constitution, puts the matter of its territorial integrity in this manner. It says, the territory of the state comprises the areas that immediately before the commencement of this Constitution were comprised in the area of Guyana, together with such other areas as may be declared by Act of Parliament to form part of the territory of the state. What the 1980 Constitution did was to receive the same territory in the 1970 Constitution, which had received the same territory in the 1966 Constitution. Most importantly, comrades, Article 1 of the Guyana's Constitution, 1980, as amended, puts the matter of its territory in the following manner. Guyana is an indivisible state. That means that its territory cannot be divided. That's the concept of indivisibility enshrined in our Constitution, Article 1.2. Allow me to make these three additional points, but critical, however, to this discussion. In addition to the indivisibility of the territory of the Republic of Guyana, nothing can be subtracted from Guyana's territory, but additions to it are contemplated. And these are expressed by the following words immediately above. That part of the article that says, and I quote, together with such other areas as may be declared by Act of Parliament to form part of the territory of the state, tells you we cannot subtract, but we can add. Secondly, Article 2 of the Republic of Guyana's Constitution, as amended, can only be amended by a national referendum. That is, a national elections. This is a continuation of the deeply entrenched nature of the territory of Guyana. Thirdly, the Republic of Guyana consistently declared in successive constitutions only that territory it received at independence of the United Kingdom. Guyana conducted no type of hegemonic acts against the people of and territory of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. In contrast, the evidence shows that Venezuela has been and continues to be the nation-state aggressor. In view of the above, I posit that the borders of the Republic of Guyana are sacrosanct, indivisible, inalienable, and therefore non-transferable. And the same reasoning attaches, in the issue of successor state, attaches to all the constitutions of Guyana and the nation-state of Guyana. Interestingly, comrades, Article 10 of the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela puts the issue of territory in this manner, and I quote, this is the Venezuelan Constitution, Article 10. The territory and other geographical spaces of the Republic are those which belonged to the Captaincy General of Venezuela before the political transformation began in April 1810, as amended by virtue of the treaties and arbitration awards, which have not been vitiated with nullity. In my view, comrades, the words as amended by virtue of the treaties and arbitration awards, which have not been vitiated with nullity, by virtue of the treaties and arbitration awards, which have not been vitiated with nullity, are of crucial importance, in that the 1899 arbitration award, which is a full, final, and perfect settlement of the boundary between Guyana and Venezuela, has been and has not been vitiated with nullity. In fact, the 1899 arbitral award remained acceptable to Venezuela by its own constitution. For context, Venezuela became independent on the 5th of July 1811, 88 years before the 1899 arbitration award. It means that the Venezuelan constitution contemplated arbitration in the future to determine its territory. And slavery, for context, ended in 1854, 43 years after Venezuela's great Bolivarian independence. Importantly, the Republic of Venezuela comprises 23 states, none of which is a territory of Essequibo. This speaks to the consistency of the territory of Venezuela never comprising the territory of Essequibo, over the history of the Venezuelan state. You heard my colleague Dr. Corton mention this action started 62 years after the 1899 arbitral award, when Guyana was approaching its own independence. In my view, what we see from Venezuela is hegemony, the behavior of a hegemon. That is a powerful state in relation to a smaller state. Apparently, comrades, without any concern for international law, particularly the UN's prohibition of the threat or use of force and respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of any state, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela prefers to resort to bellicose rhetoric and what the legal luminary of Guyana's team refer to as legal guerrilla warfare. That's what they're practicing, legal guerrilla warfare against Guyana. Its only intention is to intimidate the nation state of this country. Venezuela's actions are consistent with hegemonic conduct by a great power in pursuit of its objectives. So how does the hegemon operate? An important characteristic of the hegemon is an active demonstration that its interests must become the interests of all, referred to as hegemonic control. Hence Venezuela's conduct in the Caribbean. Hence Venezuelans' behavior with other CARICOM states. Further, Venezuela has consistently misrepresented that the Geneva Agreement governing itself in Guyana only provides for bilateral dialogue to address the border controversy surrounding the full, final, and perfect settlement by way of the 1899 arbitration award. Comrades, this is patently false and the action of a hegemon. It is odious for Venezuela to try and convince particularly the learned, Guyanese in general, citizens of Latin America and the Caribbean, international government organization, among others, that the Geneva Agreement was intended for Guyana and Venezuela to determine the validity of the 1899 arbitration award. That is not true. Only a court can determine the validity. This is beyond preposterous, but is consistent with hegemonic conduct. Further, the consistent presidential decrees by Venezuela heads of state threatening and interfering with the settled boundary between Guyana and Venezuela, and the recently announced referendum by Venezuela purported to annex the Guyana Esequibo territory are a reflection of a foreign policy towards the Republic of Guyana that is more realist than neoliberalist. In other words, a zero-sum game is the outcome that Venezuela seeks. And as posited by Mrs. Morsheimer, there is little evidence that institutions can convince the great powers to act against the dictates of realism. It is becoming clear to me that the institutions that exist are unable to get Venezuela to comply, because Venezuela has no intention of following these institutions in relation to Guyana. A fair question therefore arises: is Venezuela's hegemonic conduct towards Guyana an outlier, or do other threats await the region as it seeks to manage collective goods in and for the region? Also, the hegemon pays for influence. The hegemon also helps states make side payments and direct payments to them in order to secure cooperation. In my view, the Petro-Carib initiative is being used by Venezuela as a persuasion tool to secure cooperation of and otherwise influence CARICOM states to be at least ambivalent in their support to Guyana's territorial integrity, which is threatened by Venezuela. In this sense, Venezuela pretends to be a benevolent hegemon, and we've seen statements coming from CARICOM heads of state that are ambivalent. They're not too clear. Therefore, statements that call for Guyana, the non-aggressor, and Venezuela, the aggressor, to ensure the region remains a zone of peace, suggests to me a heeding to the wishes of the hegemon for fear of losing an economic benefit, that is oil. A question that naturally arises also, meaning, for example, are these what cause hegemonic orders? Are they designed for compliance by states within CARICOM? Is the action against Venezuela a ruse for Is the action by Venezuela against Guyana a ruse for subsequent action against CARICOM? We must not forget Board Island. CARICOM, on the other hand, comrades, as an international regime underpinned by institutional bargaining, ought to function as a counter to the hegemonic conduct by Venezuela. I'd like to turn to the threats by Venezuela and Guyana's response. Venezuela's referendum and spurious claim undermines 4 key factors of nationhood, and these factors were identified by Professor Griffith. That is our land, our people, our resources, and our identity. In other words, Venezuela's five-question referendum is an attack on Guyana's national security, national interest, and national values. In short, the nation's patrimony. Further, looked at historically, Venezuela has always posed an existential threat to Guyana, given its history of operating as an economic hitman against our people. Some responses and challenges by Guyana. Over the past 6 decades, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana firstly depended on defense diplomacy, and Dr. Corton did refer to it. And this defense diplomacy is underpinned by Article 37 of the Guyana Constitution, which focuses, among others, on sovereign equality, meaning we are equal to Venezuela. Secondly, inviolability of frontiers, and we have never violated anybody's frontier. Territorial integrity of states, we practice that. And non-intervention in internal affairs of other states. That's the ground norm, so to speak, of our foreign policy. It's in our constitution. Clearly, the actions of Venezuela offend Guyana's constitution and its patrimony. As I pointed out earlier, Venezuela's own actions are contrary to Article 10 of its own constitution. Concomitantly, comrades, Guyana subscribes to the sanctity of treaties. We uphold treaties, we believe in treaties, in accordance with international law, and has conducted its foreign relations with this as a primary objective within the boundaries of Article 37 of our Constitution. I now turn to the concept of total national defense, touched on by Dr. Curtin. Again, over the past 6 decades, we dealt with defense diplomacy. We've dealt with the issue of sovereign equality. However, together with the provisions of Article 1, which I mentioned, Article 2 of the Guyana Constitution, or the borders of Guyana, together with those, we find that the Constitution lays out the borders of the Republic of Guyana. And as I mentioned, only a national referendum can change those borders. It is important to keep repeating it. Only a national election can change our borders. Not the voice of an individual, not the president, not the prime minister, not an ex-minister. Only in national elections can change our borders. For context, it was the government of the People's National Congress that deeply entrenched the borders of Guyana in the nation's successive constitution. That's what we did as a party. For clarity, the record shows that successive PNC and later coalition governments were always concerned with protecting the territory this nation received at its independence. So to those who speak from time to time and suggest that the Geneva Agreement that President Bonham signed had anything to do with losing territory, they are wrong. Let me make it very clear. The Geneva Agreement does not speak about Essequibo. The Geneva Agreement does not speak about the border. Those two things are not in the Geneva Agreement. It speaks of the border controversy. And that controversy is because a gentleman wrote a letter only to be opened when he died to say that the arbitration procedure was false. But that letter has never been produced by Venezuela. As far as we know, we've never seen it. And that's all that Venezuela had. So technically, Venezuela was checkmated by the Geneva Agreement because they were dealing with a legal luminary called Forbes Burnham. He was checkmated, so they cannot discuss Essequibo, they cannot discuss the border controversy, so they resorted to keep pressuring Guyana to have bilateral talks in an effort to resolve the issue, which we know is impossible because it's now before the ICJ. Abhorrently, comrades, recent suggestions by a member of the current government about giving away some of Guyana's territory is anti-nationalist and anti-patriotic. To be clear, the Constitution of Guyana does not provide for giving away any of Guyana's territory except by a national election. Therefore, no president, no vice president, or cabinet minister has any constitutional authority to negotiate away any of Guyana's territory. And we must understand that. We must repeat that and tell it to our comrades and tell it to the people of Guyana. No individual can bargain our territory. Secondly, comrades, at the international level, defense diplomacy requires continuous diplomatic interactions by Guyana's diplomats and special envoys across regional and global capitals and international institutions. I know Dr. Gordon touched on it, so I wouldn't bore you too much with it. However, the success of this type of action manifests in strong international condemnation and possible intervention by friendly forces on Guyana's behalf, which acts as a counterweight against Venezuela. In short, such actions, that is, intense diplomatic efforts by our embassies and special envoys, would give an aggressor a cause to pause. That was the practice of the successive PNC governments. We always give Venezuela cause to pause because we used diplomacy and we had international allies and international friends to our side. The government of Guyana should immediately consider this type of diplomatic action instead of its current convoluted approach. Thirdly, underpinned by Article 33 of the Guyana Constitution, arose the concept of total national defense. This is where the total national material and human resources are organized and deployed to achieve total national defense in defense of the country's territorial integrity against any external aggression. This article commands every citizen to defend Guyana. It says it is the duty of every citizen to defend Guyana. That's Article 33, put in there by the PNC during who is government, by whom the late, great Forbes Burnham. The government is advised to let the citizens know that defending Guyana's territorial integrity is the duty of all the citizens and not exclusively that of the Guyanese Defense Force. What is not coming from the government is each of us has a responsibility to be part of defense. Each of us. Both the private sector, the public sector, the rich and the poor, and the not so rich and the not so poor. Each of us has a responsibility to defend this nation. All those institutions with resources have a duty to deploy those resources to the Guyanese Defense Force so the Guyanese Defense Force can ably defend this nation. In this context, the government is further advised to tap into and harness all the human resources available in this country. The unity approach of defense in the defense of Guyana does not end with parliamentary speeches, comrades. As is the case, it continues until the nation-state of Guyana is returned to territorial safety. Finally, defense diplomacy by itself is insufficient. The government of Guyana must provide the Guyana Defense Force with adequate and operable defense assets so it can effectively defend the nation state. What might be Venezuela's ultimate objective? And I will close here. When I analyze the dangerous and bellicose language used by Venezuelan officials in support of its referendum, which is internationally illegal, which is unlawful, that referendum is executable, and the fact that of the 23 states in Venezuela's constitution, none is executable, it is not beyond reason that such alarming actions by Venezuela may well be a ruse, a trick, for President Maduro, via the expected yes to question 5, which is the annexing of Essequibo, to turn and tell the Venezuelan people that he had a referendum, you agreed to Venezuela, to Essequibo being part of Venezuela, and therefore now we will incorporate it as the 24th state in the Constitution of Venezuela. I believe, comrades, that is the ultimate objective of President Maduro. And that is what the government of Guyana and the CARICOM region must guard against. That is a message that our diplomat must speak in global capitals, that this is something Venezuela is planning. Because, as I said before, all through the history of Venezuela, it never enshrined, never placed Essequibo in its constitution. Never. And I believe this is what Maduro is planning to do right now. I thank you very much for listening to me.
Vincent, excuse me, unfortunately I have to leave to have a catch and go to the West Amaro.
I'm about to address.
I'm saying I have to leave to go over the river to get back to West Amaro. So maybe I could organize the forum for the West Amaro folks. All right?
Yeah, but thanks very much. I'm going to respond to the question you asked, though. No, that won't be long.
The last boat is 8 o'clock, so I have to make sure I get over there because I didn't drive over here.
Less than a minute.
Okay.
I think the question you asked is an interesting question, but I wouldn't respond to it from the perspective of we have missiles coming from the then PPP, Dr. Jagandas, prior to independence. I think that the political outlook of the PPP then would have contributed to the views held by United States and United Kingdom in relation to Guyana at the time of independence. And to some extent, that could have emboldened Venezuela. In that sense, I think, yes, there's some merit in that kind of analysis and thinking, that it could have been emboldened, but I don't think the claim itself is linked to that. I think the actions subsequent to its spurious claim, those actions are linked to that because the claim itself came from the posthumous letter, which they use as a trick, as I would say, to convince others, countries, that we have something going on. So that would be my answer to that question that Malcolm asked. If I may comment on, let's go to my notes here. If I might comment here, I don't have an answer to the question raised, how does Guyana operate within the grouping in which Venezuela sits at the time that Venezuela is threatening Guyana? I think the extent to which I understand diplomacy, it's a tough one, but I think it will show the mettle of our diplomats to conduct themselves in the same forum in Venezuela at the time that Venezuela is threatening Guyana. I think Dr. Court will agree with me that there's no need for us to withdraw. We can't withdraw from that. You have to stay engaged. That's diplomacy. The more you speak, the less you fight. You have to keep talking. People say the UN is a talk shop. It is a talk shop because once you talk, you don't fight. The other point I want to raise is, I want to contribute to, is that there are three things we need to do. And this is to the comment made by the gentleman about public information and so forth. The government needs to inform, motivate, and then mobilize. These three things the government should be doing. What we're seeing now is an attempt at informing, but at no stage the government is close to motivating the population and mobilizing the population. So forums like these are very important because we really can't depend on the government. So what is identified as critical indeed is a big gap. But I don't think we can expect the government to fill this gap, because I don't think it's grounded in their political philosophy. There's no unity grounded there. It's simply about getting the opposition to a point in time in Parliament to have a joint statement and after then go it alone. For example, I mentioned unity doesn't end with the parliamentary speeches. We have a post on Facebook showing the President and Commander-in-Chief on some border location, I'm not sure, with our troops. When you look at the picture very carefully, it doesn't really reflect, it doesn't make the GDF look as professional as it is. It looks as though it's a walk in the park by the president. He's lying in a hammock with some troops around him, and they're not completely dressed because of the time when he went. One can read so much into a photograph, really perhaps diminishing the effect of the Guyana Defense Force and make them look awkward in the photograph with the president. As a member of the Guyana Defense Force, I don't take too lightly to that kind of representation being put out there by I don't know what to call it, but to say that the kind of media spotlight is placed by the president and his team. So in addition to motivating, like informing, motivating, mobilizing, I do agree that geography matters. What we didn't mention, is that there is a maritime boundary that Guyana has delimited based on the land boundary. We have a maritime boundary, 240,000 square kilometers of maritime space is also part of Guyana. So from the land boundary that was settled in 1899, Guyana drew its western boundary, and as you might be aware, its eastern boundary was delimited by International Court of Justice. So we have all those waterways, all those waters offshore, and the minerals belong to Guyana. So let's not forget that we have 240 1,000 square kilometers of sea space that we also own, and we have already delimited based on the land boundary. So I thought that it was important to mention that also as we speak about territorial integrity of Guyana. And here I can pause. Take a pause here.
Final question as we start to wind up.
Yeah, quickly, I just want to reinforce the same point from the soldiers and the same picture that Dr. Bess would have mentioned. We see on DPI. We saw aggression by the Venezuelan government, their soldiers at the borders, etc. And in dealing with that, we would have sent our soldiers to the borders as well. But what we see as, yet again, is another level of disrespect to our soldiers. We saw a picture, and the question I'm trying to ask basically is on the protocol. Because then we have our army men, as you said, not properly dressed, their face exposed, and they're there in a relaxed position. When the reason they're there is because there seems to be some threats to the borders. Even though we understand the differences between our strength when it comes to the military against Venezuela's strength. But yet again, they're there to at least seek some level of protection against the borders. I want to know what, from your background in the military, is there any protocols towards the media coming out, the president having a publicity stunt to come and say, no, I've been camping out with our army men at the borders? What's the protocol there? Because I think the comrade before spoke very much about how the military will be treated in this country, cleaning drains, etc. Now when is the time for them to rise to some level of defense? They then see him hanging out in hammocks, eating with the president, and just, in a more laissez-faire situation. Let's just say we didn't have that courtesy of the other countries who may have strong militaries. What would be the cause of that? That's my question to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, starting off, one people, one nation, one destiny, national motto. I agree 100%. There was a question on why Nicaragua supporting Venezuela. I would say that I think Nicaragua is supporting Venezuela because they see some ideological similarity between how they're thinking. They're both socialist nations, socialist countries, socialist-led governments. And that is one of the challenges also within Latin America. A number of the governments are socialists, and because Venezuela is a socialist, I think they feel a sense of commitment to Venezuela in that sense. And therefore, Guyana's diplomacy must be so active diplomacy to ensure we could defeat that. So I think that's one of the reasons. In relation to the defense force, I want to commend rather the distinguished lady who raised those questions and made those comments. She's well informed about the issues in Guyana, and the people you talk to, you obviously inform them of a lot of things that are happening. If a soldier is promised a house lot, or the soldiers in Guyana defense was a promised house lots, those are promises being made to citizens of Guyana. They're entitled to it. So whatever happens, if at any point in time we are engaged and there's loss of life, then it goes to the rest state. And if there's no engagement, it goes to them. Because I like to say that people do not tend to value the work of those of us who prevent conflict. It's not only those who get injured or die in conflict are heroes. Those who prevent the conflict in the first place are heroes. And we've prevented conflict for the last 60 years as a nation with Venezuela. At great cost, I must admit. So yes, it's a very good question. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about the military, as you said, doing sanitation work and the image it presents. And I think the military itself, if I were to speak honestly, will say that's really not my duty. One can understand now and again you're coming out in full support of a crisis, but not as a routine. So to that extent, yes, I think you have a good point. Issue of CARICOM, Dr. Corton spoke in it. CARICOM headquarters is located in Guyana. The headquarters is located in Guyana, and that was done based on the vision of the late Forbes Bourne, and recognizing that CARICOM could be fragmented from time to time. It was negotiated at the headquarters based in Guyana. So we are CARICOM to a large extent. That is really headquarters, and I agree, Dr. Curtin, that we should seek to ensure that we become the leaders in CARICOM to keep CARICOM going. We cannot do it alone. CARICOM represents 15 votes in the United Nations. And if Guyana could get CARICOM to see a regional approach to solutions, a regional approach to solutionize problems within the region, then we have 15 votes on our side. A question was asked about Venezuelan refugees. I speak in my personal capacity here. I'm on record as saying that we need to have an amnesty. First of all, announce an amnesty and ask all the Venezuelan nationals to come to that amnesty. So we separate those who have Guyanese parentage, because you know they're entitled to documentation, from those who are refugees who are not entitled to documentations. They're entitled to be treated under the IOM, under the Refugee Convention, with certain rights, the right to work, but not the right to vote. And those who qualify to be economic migrants. And those economic migrants themselves have a right to work, but they don't have an automatic right to vote. That has not been taken up by the government of Guyana. That is still languishing, but that is a proposal to deal with the Venezuelan nationals in Guyana, which provides some comfort to all our people that we know who they are, where they are, and particular rights they have. The question on protocol on reporting, the protocol on reporting the military. Yes, there ought to be a protocol, and there is a protocol. To answer Kirby's question, I believe what was required, in my view, with that visit by the president acting as the commander-in-chief, is that the troops in a combat deployment mode is what would provide a resonance of representation by the Guyana Defense Force in relation to this issue. So the fact that the picture shows the president with the troops in sort of like a casual mode. The pictures we see of Venezuela on the other side are in combat mode. So what we need is pictures in combat mode, from a distance, in combat mode, showing the readiness of the Guyana Defense Force. At some point in time, you have to rest. But it looked as though it was a photo op to me, a photo opportunity, and not really a sense of seriousness. And what it does to the Guyana Defense Force is create this image as though the Guyana Defense Force is in relaxed mode also on the borders. So it really does an injustice to the Guyana Defense Force, and there's a lack of sensitivity and sensibility to this issue coming straight from the president as the head of state. So I think they should relook and rethink it, and ensure that when you display the Guyana Defense Force on the borders which they are located on, they'll be there for decades. We have to show them in combat mode and combat readiness right now to deal with this situation if it comes to that point. So I think it's a good question, and the government should take heed about that. Additionally, let me mention that there is some events on December 3rd, one of which was a national fete at the stadium. It's now changed to National Patriotic something, but it is still at the National Stadium. December 3rd, in my view, should be National Alert Day. Every Guyanese should be on alert. There should be no congregation of 5,000 people in the National Stadium. Are we giving the Venezuelans a human target? I find it inconceivable that we'll have a national event at the stadium on December 3rd. It should be a national alert day where we're all on alert in this country in support of each other. So even though it is changed to a national something else, because we're going to have thousands of people in the stadium, that is a soft target for the Venezuelans. At the same time, when the relatives and children and brothers and sisters of those persons are on the borders defending Guyana, I think it's a miscalculation by the government, and it should not be. It should not go through. And I hope there's sufficient activism against that. My final point, perhaps, would be: I agree with the person who raised the question about respect for women. It was a vicious attack against MP Cathy Hughes, and there have been a lot of calls since then for an unqualified, I would say, apology from, in this case, I would say, the Vice President of the Guyana. The Vice President and Cathy Hughes are two elected officials. None is more important than the other. They are elected officials in this country, and each of them deserve due respect. And it is shameful on the part of the PPP to not, at this point in time, based on all my social media checks, have not issued a statement yet in condemnation of this particular activity. How can you refer to somebody as a lowlife? It is repugnant. It is repugnant. And it's a dark day in the history of this country. And when we talk about unity in effort going forward, that is disunity being practiced, perhaps deliberately so. So it is good and important to call that out. I will close by saying, my closing remarks here is that only a national referendum, only in national elections can change the borders of Guyana. And if nothing else you take away, and that's the only thing you say from this symposium, I think you'll do justice to Guyana by saying our borders cannot change only by a national referendum. I thank you very much.
Tonight to the panel. This is a wonderful gesture from the Bonham Foundation. My question to Mr. Best, was the government at any time invited you to any think tank group on these matters? One, as a military officer, have you ever envisioned that the Venezuelan military, the Venezuelan government, they're going to this referendum on the 3rd of December. In my opinion, this referendum will go through. Have you ever at any time, envisioned that the Venezuelan government might definitely send, let us say, 500 million people from the 28 million to occupy the Essequibo region? And what can we do as citizens? What would be your recommendation, for us, the citizens of Guyana, with a situation like that? How should we deal with an eventuality like that?
Thank you.
Well, quickly, the answer to your first question is no. I was never invited to any think tank or any discussion on this issue of the Guyana-Venezuela controversy, particularly as it relates to the defense of Guyana. The answer to your second question, whether I envisage it, I think if a president is threatening to annex a country, then it's equally important in that calculation to conclude there's a likelihood that troops will cross the border. So yes, I envision the possibility of it happening, and hence we are saying here and many other fora what the government of Guyana should be doing to prevent it from happening. And that's why we talk about defense diplomacy, getting international friends, getting allies to come on our side, getting statements from many organizations that will give Venezuela pause to cause, right? Cause for pause. So yes, I can envision it because of what they're saying. I can also envisage, and I'm sure you can, that if people are coming over in Venezuela at a time when they're threatening to annex Guyana, then we have to assume that in that number of persons, there are agents coming from Venezuela. If anyone should say to any Guyanese that that is an impossibility, that person is not a Guyanese. So we have to assume those things are happening. And finally, what do we do to prevent it? I thought I mentioned it just now. We need to call in the government to get every Venezuelan national under an amnesty to report to different centers across this country so we can know who are Guyanese of Guyanese parentage, who are refugees, so we can document them and give them a status, and who qualify to be migrants. And when you finish with that, those who don't qualify for any of the three categories, then we have to send them back to Venezuela. That will be the final point. So I will yield now to Mr. Benjamin.